There's probably someone you are thinking about right now, someone you have not seen in years, someone you were not thinking about yesterday, someone who was not part of your day, yet somehow they are here. Maybe it is an old classmate, a childhood friend, a former coworker, a neighbor, someone you have not spoken to in forever, and for some reason they suddenly appeared in your mind. No message, no social media post, no obvious reminder, just a random thought. Maybe you were driving home, stopped at a red light, looking out the window. Then suddenly you remembered someone you have not thought about in 15 years. Not your best friend, not your first crush, just a random person from a completely different chapter of your life. And if you are like most people, you have probably asked yourself the same question. Why them? Out of all the people you have met throughout your life, why did that specific person appear today? Because what is strange is not that we remember people. What is strange is how random it feels. One moment you are thinking about work, the next moment you are wondering where an old classmate ended up. And by the end of this video, the person you are thinking about right now may mean something very different than you think. So keep them in your mind. We're coming back to them. The strange thing is how ordinary these moments usually begin. You are doing laundry, walking through a grocery store, taking a shower, sitting at work, waiting in line for coffee. Nothing important is happening. Then suddenly someone appears. Maybe it is the coworker from a job you barely remember, the one you used to eat lunch with once a week, then never saw again. Maybe it is the kid who sat behind you in school. You were not even close, yet somehow their face suddenly appears in your mind. And that is what makes the experience so confusing. It is rarely the person you had expect. It is not always someone important. It is often someone completely ordinary, someone you have not thought about in years. Yet for a few moments they become impossible to ignore. You wonder where they are, what they are doing, whether they are happy, whether they ever think about you too. And eventually another question appears. Why am I even thinking about this person? Remember the person from the beginning, the one that immediately came to mind out of everyone you have ever met. Why them? Why today? Because the answer may have less to do with them than you think. Most people call these thoughts random, but the longer you pay attention to them, the less random they start to feel. Think about it. You have met thousands of people throughout your life. Teachers, classmates, neighbors, co-workers, friends, strangers. Most never randomly appear in your thoughts. Yet certain people return again and again, sometimes years apart, sometimes several times in the same month. And that is where it gets strange. Imagine remembering someone from high school, then 2 days later you think about them again, then again the following week. You have not searched for them, you have not seen them. Nothing obvious triggered it. Yet somehow they keep returning. Not enough to become an obsession, just enough to make you wonder, and eventually the question changes. Instead of asking, why am I thinking about them? You start asking, why does my mind keep returning to them? Because if thoughts were truly random, why do certain people repeatedly find their way back into our attention? And the answer might have nothing to do with the person themselves. Here is something fascinating. Your brain is constantly making connections without telling you. A smell reminds you of somewhere. A song changes your mood. A street feels familiar. A certain season brings back a feeling. Most of the time you don't notice the connection. You only notice the result, the emotion, the memory, the thought. People may work the same way. Imagine you've recently started a new job. You feel uncertain, a little overwhelmed. Without realizing it, your mind may connect that feeling to another period of life when you felt exactly the same. And suddenly, an old friend from that period appears in your mind. Not because of who they are, because of what your brain associates with them, or maybe you are walking through a neighborhood that vaguely resembles the one you grew up in. You don't consciously notice the similarity, but your mind does. And later that day, someone from your childhood randomly appears in your thoughts. Remember the person you've been carrying through this video? Maybe they are not connected to your past. Maybe they are connected to something happening right now. And that is a completely different possibility. Because sometimes the person is not the message. This is where things become surprisingly personal. What if the person is simply a symbol? Think about a childhood friend. When they appear in your mind, maybe your brain isn't focusing on them at all. Maybe it is focusing on what life felt like when they were around. The freedom, the curiosity, the excitement, the feeling that life was still wide open. Or maybe it is an old coworker, not because they mattered most, but because they remind you of a time when life felt different, more hopeful, more uncertain, less complicated. The person becomes a shortcut, a doorway into an entire chapter of your life. And that is why these thoughts can feel emotional, because we're often not remembering the person. We're remembering ourselves, the version of ourselves that existed around them. By now you've probably figured out who your person is. Maybe their face became clearer while watching. Maybe you remembered something about them you had not thought about in years. Now ask yourself this. If you removed their name, what would remain? A feeling, a lesson, a regret, a dream, a version of yourself. That answer may be far more important than the person themselves. And that is why some people disappear for years, then suddenly return overnight. Memory isn't organized like a filing cabinet. It is organized through connections. Feelings connect to experiences. Experiences connect to places. Places connect to people. And people connect to entire chapters of our lives. That is why someone can disappear from your thoughts for years, then suddenly return. Not because they changed, not because you changed, because something became connected again. Maybe you are facing a challenge similar to one you faced years ago. Maybe you are entering a chapter that resembles an old one. Maybe you are chasing a goal that reminds your brain of a forgotten period of your life before you are consciously aware of it. Your mind has already started connecting the dots, and sometimes the first clue is a person unexpectedly appearing in your thoughts. The thought arrives first, the explanation arrives later, sometimes much later, and sometimes never, which is why these moments feel random. But maybe they are not random at all. Maybe they are evidence of how much your mind understands before you do, and that reveals something much bigger than memory. Maybe the most interesting thing about these moments isn't who comes to mind, it is what they reveal. Most of us assume we're fully aware of what is happening inside our heads, but we're not completely. Your mind is constantly connecting experiences, comparing emotions, recognizing patterns, linking the present to the past, all without announcing it. Then every now and then, one of those hidden connections rises to the surface, and it arrives disguised as a person, an old friend, a former coworker, a classmate, a neighbor, someone you have not thought about in years, not because your mind is stuck in the past, but because something in the present quietly led you there. Remember the person from the beginning, the one who immediately came to mind, the one you've carried through this entire video. Maybe they did not appear because your mind wanted to remind you of them. Maybe they appeared because they quietly represent something else, a chapter, a feeling, a lesson, a possibility, a version of yourself, something your mind connected to what you are experiencing right now. And maybe that is why these moments feel so strange, because for a few seconds someone from the past unexpectedly walks back into the present, not physically, but psychologically. Maybe that is why certain people randomly return to our thoughts, not because they are trying to come back into our lives, but because they quietly hold a piece of a story we're still living, a feeling, a lesson, a version of ourselves, and every now and then our minds go back to find it. And I can almost guarantee something happened while watching this video. The person you've been thinking about became more specific, their face, their voice, maybe even a memory connected to them. So I'd love to know, who was it? And if you had to describe what they represent today, what would it be? A memory? A feeling? A chapter? A lesson? A version of yourself? Because sometimes the most interesting thing isn't who comes to mind, it is why.